Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
There is no betrayal. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace, a negotiated peace. As President Trump has said, stopping the killing. And so that will require both sides recognizing things they don't want to. That's why I think the world is fortunate to have President Trump. Only he at this moment could convene the powers that be to bring peace, and that's a welcome sign.
The US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth speaking at the NATO summit in Brussels, underlining this major shift we're seeing in US policy on Ukraine. Is the White House moving ahead without Europe? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to Thursday's show. Well, we're already used to waking up to another Donald Trump landmark announcement, but this one did come as a bit of a shock to Europe's leaders.
He doesn't want to end it and then go back to fighting 6 months later. We talked about the possibility, I mentioned it, of a ceasefire so we can stop the killing, and I think we'll probably end up at some point getting a ceasefire.
The US president saying he's spoken to Russia's Vladimir Putin and agreed to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. Bloomberg has learned that European leaders, perhaps characteristically, were not told about any of this before it happened.
Well, crucially, America will be a central player in negotiating that peace, it seems. It says it won't be contributing troops or money to it. This move raises major questions over Europe's role in what happens next and the defence spending more broadly in the second half of the 2020s. In fact, it even raises questions about Kyiv's role in this conversation about how to end the war. The UK's Defence Secretary John Healey saying today at that NATO meeting there could be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's the European position, but has it now been rendered irrelevant by the position taken by Donald Trump's administration?
Well, with us today on the show, joining us from that NATO meeting is our European security reporter, Andrea Palasciano. Andrea, thanks for joining us today. Just give us a bit of the context here. What was it about this phone call that really took America's NATO allies by surprise?
Thank you so much for having me. Well, basically, this is the nightmare scenario for European allies. That is exactly what they had been fearing would happen, which is Putin and Trump negotiating above their heads, behind their backs, essentially, and them not having a seat at the table. But still, this morning, when all the ministers of defense arrived at NATO, some of them tried to strike a conciliatory tone. The NATO Secretary of Defense said that there was convergence, that they were actually in agreement about ending the war. But, when you talk to the delegations and to officials, what prevails is really a sense of disbelief and of their fears materializing.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the fact that Pete Hegseth felt it necessary to say that this phone call was not a betrayal perhaps indicates some of the sentiment that he might be encountering at NATO. What sort of message is he bringing to this meeting now after we know about this phone call?
So the day started with him delivering a bit of a shock message to NATO before the phone call, saying that many of Ukraine's demands were not realistic, saying also that the U.S. would be minimally involved, if at all, in any resolution concretely on the ground. So yesterday felt like a bit like ripping off a Band-Aid, which did leave the NATO allies somewhat in disarray, because he, in a sense, said out loud what many had been saying quietly, but still, there was a sense of maybe some cards being used that could have been used in negotiations. So that's how the day started, and then the phone call came as another surprise. So it's been a pretty eventful day here at NATO.
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned the attempts at unity amongst NATO allies, but what have we been hearing from some of the European leaders, and particularly what have we heard from Ukraine about all of this?
You were right in mentioning that the word betrayal was used by some reporters. They were asking, was this phone call a betrayal of Ukraine and of partners? Of course, the Ukrainians, the Europeans are not saying that. They still want to try and get in on these negotiations. They want to have a seat at the table. They want to be as involved as they can. But to that effect, I think the Munich Security Conference this weekend will perhaps bring some more clarity as all of the European, American, Ukrainian officials gather together in Germany.
This comment that we heard from the UK's Defense Secretary about no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine, that's long been the position from European leaders on this. Is that going to be a difficult argument now to make if these talks go ahead, mooted by that phone call between Trump and Putin? Is the key goal now for other NATO allies to simply be in the room while this is happening?
Yes, this will definitely be a challenge because everything now seems to be going through Trump himself, through direct contacts. So it is unclear even like what his envoys, what, for example, a special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, what his stance will be. I think there is definitely an anxiety about not being involved. And I think in the next few days, we will see Europeans and Ukrainians try to muscle themselves back to the table. Let's see how that goes.
Andrea, one of the other things that Pete Hegseth brought up was the question of defence spending, talking about it going up to 5% of GDP, which would be more than double the current 2% target, which many members aren't already meeting. I mean, what is realistically thought of among NATO members as where defence spending could go from here?
That's a very good question. Right now, no single NATO member, not even the US, not even the highest spenders, reach 5%. And for many allies who have even been struggling to reach the current 2% goal, 5% seems totally unrealistic right now. So I think this was read in many ways as an opening negotiation position. And the numbers that have been circulating within NATO are in the 3.5 to 3.7 range. They have been ascribed as the spending numbers required to fulfill the targets, the concrete military targets and defense plans that NATO is developing right now. What I can tell you is that an agreement should be reached about new targets by the summer, by the summit in The Hague in June, hopefully. But yes, within NATO, the more, I think, realistic number that is being mentioned is 3.5, 3.7.
Yeah, really interesting. Bloomberg, big take on this on the terminal on the website today. Bloomberg Economics calculating that protecting Ukraine and also expanding Europe's own militaries could cost the continent's major powers as much as $3.1 trillion over the next year. Just talk us through the next steps in all of this. Where do we go from this in the coming weeks?
So I think now what will be interesting is how the Europeans react after this initial outrage at not having been included in this crucial conversation. I think they will have to do some serious reorganizing, and they will have to put their ducks in a row and decide where to take it from here. The line in the last months has been that they want to strengthen Ukraine. They want to bring Ukraine in the strongest possible position. So there will have to be a reassessment about that, and they will have to decide how serious they are about that. There's also the question of any further military and financial support to Ukraine. Right now, certain individual countries have pledged some things, but there hasn't been a new push or a major new announcement to support Ukraine. So, and there's also the whole conversation of putting boots on the ground. So Europeans will also have to sharpen their discussions about manning a possible ceasefire, about what they want their presence to be, and what they can bring to the table, actually.
I wonder, Andrea, where NATO as the organisation sits in all of this as well, because, if we go back a few years, we had Emmanuel Macron saying some very unkind things about NATO's existence. The war in Ukraine has obviously completely transformed the role the organisation has. Mark Rutte is the new Secretary General, relatively new, so he's now taking the reins of the organisation at what's going to be yet another pivotal time for it as well. How does this shift in position from the United States play with the function of NATO as an organisation? Is it still a useful forum for countries like the US and the UK to be discussing defence policy?
Well, one thing that was interesting yesterday about Pete Hegseth's first speech at NATO, and what all allies noted, is that he did speak in NATO language, the language of NATO, which is, we're one alliance, we are supporting each other, we are. In a sense, like the defenders of the free world, in his words, he did bring all of that language. So what NATO allies see right now is that there is, in fact, this very harsh rhetoric about increasing spending, about taking up more responsibility for the European, for the security of the European continent. But there was no sharp dismissal of the organization, which I think many were still concerned about, remembering some of Trump's statements in the past and also during his first presidency. So I would say that right now the fundamentals of NATO have not been shaken. And he did, play the game of this ministerial. He did meet everybody. He did speak in their language. So in some sense, even though the messages he delivered were very harsh, there is a reassurance that the alliance is still alive. And in the past years, the NATO has expanded. It has new members. It has the highest spending it has had since the Cold War. It is developing new defense plans, very ambitious ones. It is working towards a new spending target. So in many ways, the alliance has become a lot stronger since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, obviously, there is the question of membership in NATO for Ukraine, which has been one of the long-standing Ukrainian demands. And NATO had been saying that it would happen in the future at some point, and Hegseth has very clearly ruled that out. So there will also have to be some thinking about where the relationship between NATO and Ukraine goes from here.
Andrea, great to get your thoughts. That's Andrea Palasciano, our European security reporter, joining us from NATO. Stephen, look, in many ways, we sort of knew this was coming. Donald Trump, we know he's blunt, we know he speaks to Vladimir Putin, but it still came as a little bit of a shock that it's happened all entirely behind the backs of the Europeans. And Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, being very blunt that the US is not going to contribute any troops. He says that NATO membership for Ukraine is unrealistic and that territory will have to be given up by Ukraine. Again, all things we probably suspected, but now we've heard it all, and it has come as something as a wake-up call.
Very much in the harsh reality zone of these latest comments that we've had as well. And again, as Andrea pointed to there, this question of defence spending back to the fore. Of course, that's something that in the constrained fiscal situation that most European NATO members, including the UK, are in, could be something very key to watch in the future as well. Difficult decisions to be made by governments, including here in London. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock and our audio engineer was Sean Grostamachia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.